everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining the Maryland Center for History and Culture for our virtual program. My name is Sophie Garcia, and I serve as the Public Programs and Outreach Manager here at MCHC. I'm going to be your host for this evening's program, which is our Lord Baltimore Fellow virtual lecture, How to Create a God, the Apotheosis of Washington and the Death of Monarchy in America. This program is going to be recorded, and it will be made available for public viewing on our virtual program archive in the following weeks. This Zoom webinar is equipped with a Q&A function, so if you have questions or comments for our panelists, please use this Q&A chat and we'll reserve time at the end of the program for your questions. Now I'm going to begin the program by introducing our moderator for this evening. Please give a warm welcome to our moderator, Martina Cotto. Martina serves as the Vice President of Research and Franz Marek Director of the H. Furlong Baldwin Library. So you can go ahead and take it from here, Martina.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and welcome to everybody who's joining us tonight. As you may know, this is our second and final Lord Baltimore lecture of our programming season, and we're excited to welcome Dr. Tyson Reeder from Brigham Young University here tonight. This program will be more oriented toward the America 250 anniversary, and we're really proud to dive into these subjects that I'm certain that you all can't wait to get into as well. So as a brief introduction of Dr. Reeder, he comes to us from Brigham Young University, as I said, as assistant professor of history there, and he received his doctorate from the University of California, Davis. His research, as we will soon hear about, focuses on early American political and constitutional history, as well as the history of U.S. foreign relations. He is the author of Serpent in Eden, Foreign Meddling and Partisan Politics in James Madison's America, which is awarded 2 prizes. One was the 2025 George Washington Prize by the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, Mount Vernon, and Washington College. And the second prize was the 2024 Book of the Year Award by the Journal of the American Revolution. In addition to this title, Tyson has also authored Smugglers, Pirates, and Patriots, Free Trade in the Age of Revolution, as well as numerous articles and book chapters. He's pretty busy. He's also the editor of the Routledge History of U.S. Foreign Relations, so we're grateful for his time today. And before joining his current position at his current university, he was an assistant professor at the University of Virginia, so on our side of the United States, where he worked as an editor of the papers of James Madison. As Sophie said, please keep an eye out for the Q&A function in Zoom tonight and prepare your questions. We hope that there are many at the end of it. With that, I'm going to give the floor over to Dr. Reeder.
All right. Thank you, Martina and Sophie. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank everybody in the audience for joining us today. Let's see. Let me see if I can get my screen sharing here. It looks like from my end that's up and running, and hopefully from everybody else's end as well. I want to begin our conversation tonight with thinking about a president whose warmest admirers had to wonder if he had crossed the line into monarchy. Some of his worst critics knew he had. One of his critics, one opponent, produced a scathing satire depicting the president at the guillotine. If the chief executive had become a monarch, implied the creator, he should meet the same bloody demise as King Louis XVI, the decapitated king of the French Revolution. The president exploded with rage. He had no desire to rule as a king, he claimed, and those who accused otherwise wanted only to slander him. More sympathetic observers thought the president honest, but worried that malicious connivers surrounded him, pressing him to usurp unconstitutional authority. If they prevailed, America's Republican experiment would die. Now, the Republic would have died a premature death indeed. The president I'm talking about was George Washington. It was only 1793. My research explores how Americans framed their ideas about the executive during the colonial, revolutionary, and early national periods. offering vital perspective on today's debates. At no time since those early decades of the Republic have Americans sensed so much at stake in their disagreements over executive powers as they have been in recent years. Partisans have decried sweeping executive orders by presidents of both major parties. Political cartoonists regularly depict presidents as a king. The Supreme Court has ruled that former presidents enjoy broad immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts. During the current term, the court will determine how much control the president may exercise over independent agencies. Like early Americans, Americans today fear that any miscalculation of executive power will doom the republic, but they disagree about the limits of that power. They can better understand their present conversation by understanding its early American origins. By replacing allegiance to monarchy with allegiance to the law, early Americans exchanged a king above the law with narrow powers for a president below the law with expansive powers. And George Washington was key to that transition. In 1732, Washington was born among colonists who paradoxically minimized the king's actual power over them, but maximized his symbolic presence among them. Even when British authorities, colonists opened courts and issued legal orders in the name of the king. They displayed the king's arms in their courthouses and state houses. They read about royal processions and coronations in their newspapers. They mustered militia in the name of the king. They conflated Protestant and national holidays, such as Guy Fawkes Day, into a celebration of their Protestant monarchy that had saved them from Catholicism during the Glorious Revolution. They celebrated the king's birthday with liquor and fireworks. Royal governors compensated for their lack of real power with displays of grandeur in their palaces, dress, and entertainment. They ordered their society by rank from the monarch downward. In the colonies, the king's power was almost nowhere, but the king's spectacle almost everywhere. In July 1776, Washington mustered troops in New York to hear the Declaration of Independence, by which Congress lurched colonists from loyal subjects to traitorous rebels. In the prior months, George III had rejected a final colonial plea and declared the colonies out of his protection, meaning he would treat them more like enemies than subjects. To colonists, the king had betrayed his most influential obligation as a monarch, which was protection, their protection. According to their logic, the king withheld his protection despite their loyalty. Therefore, as the Declaration put it, he absolved them of their allegiance to him. By having the Declaration read to his troops, Washington announced that they now fought for a new cause, not a colonial rebellion, but a war for independence from George III. After hearing the Declaration read in New York, some in the crowd marched to the city's Bowling Green and toppled a statue of George III. Others threw royal portraits into flames and ripped the royal coat of arms from public displays. Some newly independent Americans punished clergy who prayed for the king. One crowd stuffed gunpowder in an effigy of George III and blew it to smithereens. The king defined their attachment to Britain, and so defined their separation from it. With the assaults and pyrotechnics, Americans rejected George III, but also revealed the intensity of their very recent loyalty. They could destroy so many royal symbols because royal symbols abounded. They were everywhere. Americans needed only to find the nearest tavern, coffee house, or church to find emblems of George III. Flags carried his name, courthouses his emblems, and public squares his statue. By then, revolutionaries had been fighting George III's troops for over a year, but his image still flourished, a reminder of their once earnest allegiance. Revolutionaries abandoned George III in an abrupt frenzy, but they limped more slowly toward anti-monarchy. Even as the Declaration of Independence announced separation from George III, it never condemned monarchy. Americans declared independence from the present king, as this highlighted portion shows, not from kingship. The Declaration even implied that kings who had not corroded into tyrants may legitimately reign over, quote, a free people. The last time English revolutionaries had listed their grievances against a king and deposed him in 1689 during the Glorious Revolution, they simply replaced him with another king. It would take more than the Declaration of Independence to turn revolutionaries into anti-monarchists. However aimlessly they stumbled into a world without kings, Americans emerged from their war for independence committed to a more egalitarian form of republicanism. No longer British, they turned to natural rights rather than British rights as the source of their liberties. By invoking natural rights, or unalienable rights, as the Declaration puts it here, they could renounce their loyalty to the British king without forfeiting the freedom that they claimed as British subjects. According to natural rights theory, as it had developed since the Glorious Revolution, all people possessed some fundamental rights from birth. To protect the most essential of those rights, they formed civil societies and then governments by their consent. If their government ceased to protect those rights or harmed them, it no longer served its legitimate purpose and the people could consent to a new government. With consent at the core of their revolution, Americans rejected hereditary office. By the end of the Revolutionary War, Americans had followed a chaotic but intuitive route to their disdain for monarchy. Independence from Britain meant independence from George III. Independence from George III meant republicanism. Republicanism meant anti-monarchism. Americans didn't revolt against George III because they were anti-monarchists. They became anti-monarchists because they revolted against George III. In the new American republics, the people replaced the king as the sovereign, and Americans had no idea what united the allegiance of a republic full of sovereigns. They had long assumed that the people paid allegiance to the king, and with that shared allegiance, they became a people. The people comprised all the king's subjects in an unapologetically hierarchical society from slaves to princes. With a single ruler as a sovereign, hierarchy seemed natural, with each person deferring to a superior until all deference flowed to the king. Vesting sovereignty in the people, Americans lost an object of allegiance, but found an object of reverence. A value as ill-defined as liberty, rights, and consent, but more uniquely American, and that was equality. They acquired their new ideas about sovereignty from natural rights theory. In a state of nature, no one enjoyed sovereignty over another. Each person possessed sovereignty over their own life, liberty, and property. Once they entered civil society, they retained their sovereignty to give or withdraw their consent from the government. Americans maintained social ranks, to say nothing of slavery, but by making every person in the body politic a sovereign, they created a new sense of political equality. With that equality, Americans discovered what made them a single people, what united them under a new allegiance, the law. In the absence of a king, the people would constitute those who together formed laws by their own consent. Created by the consent of the people, the law would protect their liberty by repelling arbitrary government and deterring licentiousness. Born from a society of equal sovereigns, those laws would operate equally on all. The law would reign supreme not because it possessed its own arbitrary will, but because it manifested the will of the sovereign people. Unlike Britain, with a single sovereign above the law, Americans had created a republic of sovereigns below the law. On May 25th, 1787, 29 delegates cast unanimous ballots to elect Washington the president of what has become called the Constitutional Convention meeting in Philadelphia. In his acceptance speech, Washington characteristically made modest apologies for the inadequacies he brought to the position. As part of his apologies, he remarked that he had no precedent to follow, nothing to guide him in his duties as the president of such a body. He participated, as his friend James Madison recorded it, in a novel scene of business. As Washington hinted, the delegates embarked on a monumental experiment, hoping to unite an expansive and diverse people under a national law. During the previous years, Americans had practiced their new forms of consent, liberty, and political equality in their states. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal Congress had remained more of a diplomatic assembly, functioning nothing like a national government. Each state retained its independence. Now, despite some advantages, that system left the states vulnerable to internal discord and foreign threats. The delegates intended to fasten Americans to a new national government with a written constitution as the fundamental law. They would test if that law could replace monarchy as an object of allegiance across such a vast republic. Monarchy's specter vexed the delegates as they discussed presidential elections and powers. Americans believed less that the king had possessed too much power than that he had misapplied the power he did possess, exerting too much against the colonies and too little against Parliament. Imploring the king to intervene with Parliament, they ascribed to him power that he did not in fact enjoy. Of the last two kings that had defied Parliament, one had lost his head and the other his throne. George III had little interest in following their example, even had he agreed with the colonists, which he had not. When Continental Congress declared independence, they had exaggerated the king's power over the colonies to paint him as a tyrant, as the Declaration calls him here. Overestimating the king's power to restrain Parliament and to oppress the colonies, they believed he exercised the wrong powers for the wrong reasons. At the Constitutional Convention, delegates sought less to strip the executive of power than to ensure that he exercised the right power for the right reasons. When independent states had created their constitutions, they made weak governors less out of spite for executive power than because they had accidentally plunged into a Republican revolution. Governors to early Americans meant royalty, either royal governors appointed by the crown or proprietary governors appointed by proprietors who received their charter from the crown. Absent royal authority in the new states, governors seemed almost just extraneous. Without independent executives, many Americans worried that the states had descended into chaos wrought by legislatures too beholden to the whim of popular politics. Remembering a king unwilling to restrain Parliament and state governors unable to check legislatures, convention delegates enhanced executive power and independence in the Constitution. They matched many of the president's powers to the king's, such as the pardon power, commander-in-chief power, and extensive appointment and treaty-making powers. To enhance the president's independence, they limited Congress's control over the presidential salary. By doing so, they abandoned the practice of colonial assemblies, which had controlled the salaries of royal governors, limiting the crown's influence over the colonies. Most significantly, they conferred on the president a veto power, the power they had wished George III had employed against Parliament. Although George III possessed a nominal power of veto, no king had used it against Parliament since before the Glorious Revolution. While Congress enjoyed some tighter controls on the president than Parliament had on the king, the president would also enjoy tighter controls on Congress than the king had on Parliament. Having created an executive office with significant power, the delegates stripped the man in the office of any personal allegiance owed by the people and placed him below the law. The British limited their king by the law, but they could not judge him under the law. By the Constitution, the president faced impeachment, removal, and even indictment for laws broken. The king swore to govern according to the laws of Parliament, but the president did something more akin to swearing allegiance to the Constitution to preserve, protect, and defend it. By law, certain British officers swore allegiance to the king. American officers swore to support the Constitution. While limited by parliamentary laws, the king had sovereign control over his council, and he could pardon council members impeached by Parliament. The president depended on the Senate to confirm members of his cabinet, and he could pardon criminal cases, but not impeachment convictions of his cabinet. Cabinet members served, therefore, at the pleasure of the public trust, not just the good graces of the president. Finally, the king ruled for life. The president faced an election every 4 years, making him accountable to the sovereigns of the nation. Recalibrating executive control over the legislature and legislative control over the executive, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention designed a presidency more powerful, but also more accountable than the king. Colonists had discarded a king who possessed extensive theoretical authority in the colonies, but little practical power. Even when the crown tried to enforce Parliament's new taxes that had enraged colonists, authorities collected almost no revenue from the recalcitrant Americans. With the new Constitution, Americans would elect a president with an expansive mandate to, quote, take care that the laws be faithfully executed. In 1789, as Washington traveled to New York to take his oath of office, one could hardly have guessed that Americans owed him no personal allegiance. They thronged to celebrate him as he passed city to city. He arrived in New York to festooned ships, cannonades, music, euphoric crowds, and a parade. That evening, as they had done on kings' coronations and birthdays, the New Yorkers showered their city with candlelight. One New Yorker observed that Washington stood, quote, upon a scale of eminence that heaven never before assigned to a mortal. At the Constitutional Convention, delegates had toiled to create a strong executive without creating a monarchy, but Americans had little practice separating the two. In April 1789, George Washington took an oath that defined his differences from George III. When George III took his coronation oath to govern according to the statutes in Parliament, he swore to abide by laws passed in the name of the king. When he promised to cause law and justice in mercy to be executed, he became the overseer of the law. In contrast, when Washington took his presidential oath to faithfully execute the office of president, he swore to enforce the laws passed by authority of the Constitution. When he promised to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, the law became his overseer. The coronation oath limited a king who owned the law. The presidential oath empowered a president who answered to the law. Senators debated what to call this new executive, some of them unwilling to take the cue from the Constitution's use of president. They considered titles such as Majesty or Serene Highness. In my favorite example, one Washington devotee suggested that just as the Romans had adopted Julius Caesar's name to make Caesar a title for emperors, Americans use Washington as a presidential title. So we would be living with Washington Trump and Washington Obama and Washington Bush and so on. The imperial overtone seemed ominous for Republicans who wanted an accountable executive. Washington labored to meet the dueling expectations of the new office, executive grandeur and Republican restraint. He and Martha hosted weekly levees, tinging them with formality that reminded some observers of a monarchical court. The levees attracted distrust from Americans most suspicious of monarchy. Washington tried to balance the formality of the levees with simpler, more intimate venues to repel concerns that he might succumb to monarchy. In Gilbert Stuart's painting of Washington, regal surroundings envelop Washington, but he wears modest black attire that conveyed Republican simplicity, a Republican in royal trappings. While Americans vacillated over how monarchical they wanted to make their president, the French demonstrated how to kill a king. Guillotining Louis XVI in 1793, French revolutionaries inaugurated a new era of regicide and aggravated debates over monarchy in the United States. To Americans who sympathized with monarchy, Louis's severed head warned against the worst excesses of the revolutionary moment. To those who favored French revolutionaries, it culminated the Republican spirit of the age. As Washington tried to manage all of these disputes, he secured power to the presidency, leading his opponents to accuse him of monarchical proclivities. Convinced that the presidency needed independence and energy, Washington sought to enhance what he considered the president's prerogatives under Article 2 of the Constitution. In the first year, he secured the ability to fire his cabinet officers at will. After a failed consultation with the Senate on foreign affairs, he ignored the legislative body except when he needed their consent as mandated by the Constitution. From then on, he conferred with his cabinet members on matters of critical importance rather than confer with the Senate. He declared neutrality in French and British hostilities, assuming for the presidency greater control over war and peace. He enhanced the presidency's war-making powers as he fought Indian nations without a congressional declaration of war. In his strongest exercise of executive authority, he personally led troops against insurrectionists in western Pennsylvania. Where the Constitution blurred lines, Washington steadily accrued authority for the presidency. In the new Republican government, Washington enjoyed what no British king had commanded in North America: personal allegiance and significant executive power. His political detractors and foreign leaders learned that he commanded the personal admiration of the vast majority of Americans. They paid him something like the personal allegiance they had paid to kings. With that esteem, he enhanced the presidency's independence from Congress and the power to execute U.S. law. As Washington's power crescendoed in unison with the people's admiration for him, he did the most unmonarchical thing he could do. He surrendered his power and his office. Ignoring the advice of confidants who implored him to remain, Washington chose not to run for a third term, retiring in 1797. Americans had little practice imagining themselves as a nation, but Washington's presidency had given them a unifying object of veneration. They felt untested as they braced to perpetuate their nation in his absence. By retiring, Washington respected the superiority of the presidency to the president, the office a creation of the law, the person merely an instrument of the office. The presidency would endure beyond his retirement, just as the king's body politic endured as the body natural decomposed. Since the Middle Ages, English theorists had labored to make kings immortal. They split the king into his body natural and his body politic. His body natural being a mortal lump of clay that would wither back to dust, versus the body politic, which was his divine office that would last the ages. But unlike the body politic that subsumed the body natural and made the king an object of allegiance, the presidency effected no such change in its occupant. With his farewell, Washington endorsed the Constitution's separation of the president from the presidency. Without Washington's gravitas, Americans began to view the president less as an object of shared reverence than as a political opponent to topple. Washington had balanced competing factions of Republicans and Federalists through stormy controversies, a task under which even he started to strain by the end of his presidency. Many Americans fretted that the nation could ill survive a torrent of invective aimed at the executive in speeches, pamphlets, and newspapers. As admiration for the person of the president faded, John Adams and other Federalists sought to coerce reverence or at least prevent derision. Convinced that the nation depended on unity and unity on shared esteem for the executive, Federalists passed the Sedition Act. The act criminalized scandalous writings about the president and government, believing that the president needed executive energy and personal reverence. Proponents of the act sought to preserve simultaneously the president's power and reputation. In addition to punishing seditious writers, it punished those who opposed any action the president took under, quote, the powers in him vested by the Constitution of the United States. So the Constitution still reigned as taskmaster. But the act's proponents could scarcely fathom a nation in which citizens disrespected the executive. In the absence of a single leader to venerate, Americans worried their nation might crumble. On December 14th, 1799, Washington died in his bed late in the evening, unintentionally granting Americans a perpetual figure of reverence. With his death, he passed into the realms of divinity, imagined and portrayed by Americans as part of the pantheon. After his retirement made him a demigod, his untimely death vaulted him to his seat among the deities. From heaven or Olympus, Washington tended his vulnerable country. Among the gods, Washington became the father of his nation, a position occupied by kings in monarchies. Washington granted Americans his unifying presence from beyond the grave, uniting them in mourning, celebration, and commemoration. With the immortal Washington as the father of the nation, presidents no longer needed to occupy that role, allowing Americans to complete the separation of the president from the presidency. They could elect an executive rather than a patriarch. We can explore these themes through the creation of Baltimore's Washington Monument, the first colossal memorial to Washington. The architect of the monument, Robert Mills, proposed that escutcheons representing states adorn the frieze of the monument's pedestal. They would embrace, as he put it, the idea of all the existing states paying honor to their political father. He also wanted inscriptions on the column that would celebrate the great and magnanimous act in Washington's life which constitutes his chief glory, his resignation as commander-in-chief. The inscription was to read, here it's shown in Latin, translated it would read, his fame immortal because ill of the people. Mills wanted to inscribe the words in Latin, a language as immortal as Washington. While Mills didn't get his inscription on the column, he did get the statue of Washington resigning his commission. Of the inscriptions that ended up on the Sokol, 2 commemorated Washington's surrender of power. One paralleled his appointment as commander-in-chief with his resignation of his commission, and the other his presidency with his retirement. Washington achieved immortality not by his kingship, but by his anti-monarchical surrender of power. On the base of the monument, Mills intended an inscription to read, "To George Washington, the father of his country, under whose command, with the blessing of Providence, the Confederated Americans obtained liberty and laws." Early Americans ushered liberty, consent, and equality into a paramount commitment to the rule of law. They rarely defined liberty as the ability to do what they pleased. They called that licentiousness and assumed it would diminish liberty by breeding chaos that favored the powerful over the virtuous. Rather, they usually equated liberty with freedom from arbitrary government. Americans intended to create laws that would operate equally on all citizens by their own consent. Under the rule of such laws, they could maximize their liberty by constraining licentiousness and arbitrary government alike. Because law would embody consent, liberty, and equality, Americans made it the core of their new allegiance. Encapsulated by Mill's plans, Americans turned Washington into an immortal god and thereby relinquished their personal allegiance to the presidency. Kings became the immortal father of their people because they were kings. Washington became the immortal father of his people because he would not be a king. By creating a president who exercised expansive powers but commanded no allegiance, Americans have developed a conflicted relationship with the executive. When the president's opposition has fretted that the executive has acquired too much power, they have flung accusations of monarchy. In reality, the framers designed a presidency with independence from and checks on Congress that they had wished George III had exercised against Parliament. In terms of the control exercised over Americans, British kings never outpaced U.S. presidents, so power alone makes a poor differentiation between kings and presidents. More than power alone, Americans feared the combination of power in and allegiance to the executive. British Americans gave the king allegiance, but they resisted his power. Independent early Americans gave the president power, but they refused him allegiance. Schooled in monarchy, they had trodden a halting path to deny presidents allegiance. By uniting as a nation in the name of the deified Washington, though, they denied future presidents any semblance of allegiance. They would give their allegiance to the law. Sovereign Americans replaced immortal possessors of the law with mortal stewards of the law. Presidents would occupy the presidency, not become the presidency. They would enforce the law, but not own the law. In the English tradition, the king's body natural housed the body politic. The two fused in an inseparable union. At the death of the body natural, the body politic survived and descended on another. In their legal tradition, the English spoke not of the death of the king, but of the demise of the king. For the body politic survived in a new body natural. The king couldn't die. Like the English, Americans had created an immortal father of their nation, but it was the deified Washington rather than the living president. Because Washington lived, presidents could die. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tyson. I was writing notes throughout your talk. There are so many concepts that you brought about, abstract and concrete, with their meaning both, during the time of the revolution and then how we view them today. So there's a lot to unpack and a lot to think about. I would like to, as you catch your breath after your talk, I would like to invite our attendees, our participants, to please take a look at the Q&A function on the bottom of your screens and let us know what questions you have for our presenter today. We're really keen on hearing your thoughts, even if it's just a comment. Please let us know. I was thinking about, just to get us started, as you were going through the concepts and taking us, through the progression between monarchy and republicanism, about the formation of a new identity that happened, right? So for all intents and purposes, the very early resistance and skirmishes still presumed that the people who lived in the colonies were British, right? They considered themselves British subjects. And at some point, and it's a long process, at some point, an American identity emerges. So it's one thing, like you said, to withdraw your allegiance from the king and to give it to somebody else, but still consider yourself to be a British subject, to, at the end, actually come up with a whole new national identity. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how the concepts of monarchical versus anti-monarchical sentiments play into that national identity formation, a process, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it kind of anti-monarchical versus anti-monarchical sentiments, in some ways, split the early American identity. That you have a lot of people who are, um, we might say, sympathetic to monarchy. Very few Americans really wanted a monarch, but for a lot of them, that was because they supposed, I mean, how do you just create a monarch? I mean, monarchy is inherited, so it's not something you can really create very well. But they were still sympathetic to the idea of monarchy, and so it creates a lot of distrust among early Americans. That you have Alexander Hamilton and versus James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, and they think that Hamilton is kind of a closet monarchist, and even and John Adams himself they assume is kind of a closet monarchist, and so actually this difference divides early Americans, and that's why I think that the death of Washington is so critical, because now they say we have one national father. It doesn't need to be the president. And so with the death of Washington, it's a really critical moment in the creation of an American identity.
Definitely. And I'm also reminded of the fact that, it's a process. So at the end of it, we will end up with the American identity being inextricably connected with republicanism, right? With an anti-monarchical approach. And it will take until the 1830s and Martin Van Buren to have a first president who is born in the United States. So
Right.
that's almost 60 years after the revolution of transformation of that identity. I yeah.
Van Buren, I mean, that gets us into the Jackson period, and that's really when. So I mentioned early on, with the early slides, that it was actually Washington who was the first president who was depicted by his critics as a monarch, even like this one that's suggesting maybe he needs to go to the guillotine. But it's really with Andrew Jackson that becomes a trope, that the president depicting the president as a monarch becomes a real trope, and it's one that's really lasted ever since. You do get some early peppering. Some people claim that Jefferson wanted to become a king, so it's really been around for a long time that presidents want to be kings, but yeah, it's based on this odd idea that a king is somebody who exercises expansive power, when really British monarchs just didn't exercise very much power, not over Americans, and even during the 19th century into the age of Jackson, the British monarch is progressively losing power. So power makes, yeah, as I said, a poor differentiation here.
Mm-hmm. Does geography play a part? Because you have a monarch who is so far removed, literally across the ocean, and you mentioned the trickle down of, there's the monarch above everybody, and then subsequent layers of power by the time you get to, the populace, the general populace. How much does that play a role, that you had a governor or you had an emissary or somebody else ruling on behalf of somebody else? Whereas once you talk about Washington, he is present, he is corporeal. There is a physical, figure.
Yeah.
Not to go into the symbolism of it all, or not yet, but just that physicality of the presence of power, or I guess materiality of power. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So the presence of power, I first think of the Whiskey Rebellion that I quickly alluded to in the talk. But yeah, Washington is literally leading troops as a commander in chief in uniform against whiskey rebels. I mean, that's obviously something George III was never going to do against colonial rebels. So you do have just a presence of power in the country itself. Now, when we talk about distance for colonial Americans before independence, the distance kind of played an advantage to the king because the king is this distant father figure that unites them all. And so Americans can kind of imagine the king as anything they want. And some studies have shown that the English were far less enamored with the king than Americans were. That Americans pay this lip allegiance to the king that's just not really seen in other places in the empire. I mean, it's really intense in America. And there have been some suggestions, and I think they're right, that it's that because that loyalty, again, at least that lip service loyalty was so intense for Americans that when they feel like that's betrayed, the revolution turns radical very quickly.
Yeah, thank you. And also along those lines of, the presence of power, there are threads in your presentation that went from, I'm reading from my notes, a loyalty to, human figures or allegiance to human figures such as the king and such as the president, to switching to loyalty to, let me put it as principles or ideas or codes or codified language, right? So
Mhm.
the presumption is that the law is something that will survive generations and that is maybe separate from human fallibility or human mortality or just, human beings themselves. But at the same time, we're finding the law embodied in the king or in the president. You mentioned the body natural, the body politic. I'm interested in this dynamic in just how the ideas are presented to people. It sounds like we want to make them concrete, but we also want to make them abstract enough to still be,
Mhm.
adherable to.
Yeah. So when in terms of the abstract principles, um, I Americans are, I think, willing. I think those at the continental, or excuse me, at the Constitutional Convention are willing to give the president more power because they assume that he will not command this personal allegiance.
Mm-hmm.
And so they they move from the abstract to the concrete. So the British monarch has an abstract power over the law. When Parliament passes laws, they pass laws in the name of the king. The law is the king's. To some extent, this is only abstract, right? Like the kings in Britain were obviously uh, had their power curbed, like going clear back to the Magna Carta. In many ways, the king's power was curbed, but still, the sort of the official legal narrative was that the law belonged to the king. The king was above the law, even if and all that the king was doing was agreeing to be limited by the law. So the king is doing it of his own accord. Now, of course, that's kind of nonsense. It really was the people in Parliament who rebel against kings at different times. But even after that, if you read the 1689 Bill of Rights, English Bill of Rights closely, or Declaration of Rights, it still maintains this official narrative that the king essentially is above the law. And that they are just by their magnanimity agreeing to limit their powers in these ways. American revolutionaries, I would say, and delegates at the Constitutional Convention didn't feel like they needed to be bound by such niceties. They just said, we don't owe allegiance to the king. The law is the king, as Thomas Paine put it in Common Sense. The law is the king, and so everybody is below the law, and we're just dispensing with the pretense.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you mentioned the Magna Carta, and I think this might be my last question, unless somebody wants to put in a last minute question in the box. You mentioned the Magna Carta, and as you were talking about the Constitution, replacing whatever the king stood for, And I forget how your phrasing worked, but you mentioned it as a test or an experiment of sorts, and it made me think about how most modern countries have a constitution these days, but at the time that we're speaking of, the United States was actually paving the way. Yes, there were ancient comparable legal documents that we could describe as constitutions. There was the Magna Carta in British history, but how do you see the United States Constitution in the continuity of this history as being that test ground for what comes later, what all the other constitutions that modeled themselves after the United States?
Yeah, it breaks new ground again. If we stick with the British example, but we could go to all sorts of examples in the past and ancient worlds where the a king is the lawgiver. So no matter how much the king is limited, the king remains the lawgiver. Constitutions are given and created by kings or by some sort of leader. The American experiment is going to verge away from that and say that the law is fundamental. That's what Americans owe allegiance to, because we have this republic of sovereigns. I mean, it's a little, the American experiment is really tricky, or republicanism is really tricky, because how do you create a nation full of sovereigns? A sovereign, by definition, means you don't owe allegiance to anybody. And so what can Americans owe allegiance to if they're sovereigns? Well, they'll actually, these sovereigns will owe allegiance to the laws that they create. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's the fundamental basis of republicanism, is that at least in America, Americans consent to the laws as sovereigns, but then they owe allegiance to those laws they create with their co-sovereigns.
Thank you. Thank you so much for tonight's conversation. It was illuminating. It was thought-provoking. It will definitely make us think more in terms of our present day movements and where we are. I really appreciate your time. And I want to thank everybody tonight who joined us, and everybody who might be watching this program as a recording. So as Sophie joins us to sign us off for tonight, I also want to invite everybody to consider joining us for some remaining public programs, virtual and in person, for the rest of our season, and maybe even join us as members, because we have a lot of benefits and a lot of ways to engage with you. So appreciating everybody's time tonight, and handing it back to Sophie for the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. And thank you to everyone for joining tonight. We're so grateful for your attendance and your participation. We're going to wrap up here. Have a lovely rest of your night, and we hope to see you at another MCHC program.